When Britain stood almost alone against Nazi Germany in 1940, Winston Churchill refused to consider defeat. He steadied a terrified nation with plain words, simple plans, and stubborn courage, not magic, just habits you can copy. Watch this calm biography to learn 3 practical leadership lessons: how to speak so people actually listen, how to make fast decisions when the pressure's on, and how to bounce back after a big setback. First, we'll explain each idea in plain language and with everyday examples, like steering a last-minute group project, choosing what to do first when nothing seems obvious, or getting back on your feet after a setback. No heavy theory, just useful tactics you can try tomorrow, and yes, we'll smile at his cigars and hats along the way. Childhood sparks, genetics, environment, and ambition. Winston Churchill grew up inside a family that mixed old British aristocracy with American showmanship. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a prominent British politician, and his mother, Jenny Jerome, came from a wealthy American social circle and brought a flair for publicity. He spent childhood years surrounded by books, portraits, and the expectations that come with a famous name, and he was sent to schools like Harrow where boys were trained to stand out. Those facts set the stage for a life in public view. Some parts of who we are come from our genes, which are like a family recipe for temperament and talent. If both parents are quick to speak and enjoy being noticed, a child can inherit a tendency to be bold or drawn to the spotlight. In Churchill's case, the combination of a combative political father and a socially ambitious mother likely helped shape his natural appetite for argument, performance, and persistence. Think of it like inheriting a loud laugh or a stubborn chin. Traits get passed down and then mixed with learning and experience. The environment around a child matters just as much. Being raised in an aristocratic household meant access to books, tutors, and conversations about power and history, but it also meant a lot of adult comings and goings and periods away from family life. Those conditions push a child to develop self-reliance. Many children raised with nannies and tutors learn to entertain themselves, and that private practice time can turn into a habit of reading, writing, or rehearsing speeches aloud. In simple terms, privilege gave him tools, while partial emotional distance taught him resilience. Ambition often springs from that mixed soil of nature and nurture. Exposure to politics at home made public life seem possible, while inherited stubbornness made quitting unthinkable. He began to write and to work on his voice, habits that are obvious in the careers he later chose. A practical example: children who grow up hearing dinner table debates learn the rhythm of argument. They practice making a point without noticing. That's how an early appetite for persuasion becomes a lifelong habit. Everyday examples help show how these forces combine. A child whose parents are doctors may grow up understanding clinics and emergencies and be comfortable with responsibility. Another child raised by a parent who loves music might start experimenting with sounds before school starts. Add a dose of inherited temperament, a tendency to be outgoing, or to keep chipping away at a task, and you can see why some kids aim very high. A little humor helps too. If ambition were a family heirloom, it would need polishing, and Churchill learned to polish his until it shone under bright lights. In short, the sparks in his childhood came from both what he was born with and what he was surrounded by. Genes handed him certain inclinations, the environment handed him books, speeches, and expectations. Together they fed an early drive to perform and to lead, the kind of practical blend of traits you can spot today in anyone raised in public life, and perhaps in your neighbor's child who never misses a school debate. The soldier reporter, field experience and narrative skills. As a young officer who also wrote for newspapers such as the Daily Graphic and the Daily Telegraph, Churchill learned to move between the dirt of the front line and the clear space of a blank page. He saw action in places like Cuba, India, Sudan, and South Africa, and he did not simply relay facts, he translated what he lived into stories people read with their eyes open. His capture and dramatic escape during the Boer conflict became a vivid example of how direct experience could be turned into compelling reportage and later into the longer book that made the episode familiar to a wide public. He developed habits that any good storyteller or leader would envy: careful observation, quick judgment, and an ear for dialogue. Rather than scribbling only grand claims, he noted small sensory details, mud on a boot, the way a messenger breathed, then used those details to ground larger points about courage, confusion, and morale. Think of it like telling a friend why a storm knocked out your power. You don't start with the physics, you begin with candles flickering on the kitchen table. Churchill did the same with battle scenes, and those little images made even complex military moves feel immediate. Being both soldier and reporter sharpened his credibility. When he described a failed attack or praised an officer's steadiness, people listened because he had been there. Newspapers amplified his voice, but it was the combination of witness and writer that gave his words weight. He turned dispatches into fuller accounts, books that mixed scene-by-scene reporting with reflection, and that habit of converting immediate notes into structured narrative is a practical lesson for anyone who wants to influence others. Eyewitness detail builds trust, and clear storytelling builds understanding. Style mattered to him as much as substance. On the battlefield he had to be concise, a dispatch needed to be read quickly and understood even in a crowded club. In longer works he let scenes breathe and context grow. In everyday life the same skill applies. Telling a colleague what went wrong in a meeting requires short, sharp facts. Writing a report may need the backstory. Keep a small notebook, record what you see, choose one sensory detail to start with, and then explain why it matters. He carried a rifle and a notebook, literally, and the combination taught him how to lead people not just by orders but by stories they could grasp and pass on. Early political trials, learning from defeat. During the early stages of his public life, Churchill made a dramatic break with his original party over the issue of free trade versus tariff reform, a decision that cost him allies and forced him to prove that his principles were genuine rather than opportunistic. He knew very well that politics rewards consistency, and so he set about explaining himself in speeches, articles, and books. He did not simply sulk. Critics accused him of changing sides for advantage, and that sting sharpened his political instincts. He treated setbacks like a craftsman treats a blunt tool, by sharpening it. Writing became his workshop. Newspaper dispatches, pamphlets and long essays gave him a way to reach ordinary people directly and to rehearse arguments until they were tight. Friends and rivals alike learned to expect Churchill in print as much as in the Commons, and this steady output helped him rebuild trust after the rout of critics and the chilly reception from former colleagues. It was practical and effective political work, like fixing a leaky roof rather than waiting for the next storm. Feedback mattered to him. When colleagues pushed back, he listened, adjusted his tone, and sometimes changed tactics while keeping the backbone of his beliefs. In everyday terms, he treated electoral rebukes and hostile newspapers the way a small business owner treats bad reviews: analyze them, keep what is valid, and respond publicly to restore confidence. He also forged alliances across old fault lines, learning that a single brilliant speech could win attention but sustained friendships and shared policy work won power. There was also a softer lesson in all this: personal resilience. Churchill did not vanish after defeat. Instead he worked harder, learned from the mistakes that had been pointed out, sometimes painfully, and used humiliation as instruction rather than an excuse. That kind of recovery is familiar to anyone who has lost a job interview or watched a project fail. Accept the loss, find lessons, and prepare a better case for next time. And yes, he liked his cigars and his solitary walks, so humor and habit kept him human through the rough patches. The art of preparation, rearmament and foresight. In the late 1930s Churchill sounded repeated alarms about a resurgent Germany and urged Britain to rebuild its armed forces, especially its air defenses. He used speeches in Parliament and articles for the public to push for concrete steps rather than vague warnings, pressing leaders to expand pilot training and aircraft production. He did not only argue in abstract, he pointed to practical gaps: too few fighters on standby, insufficient anti-aircraft batteries, and a shortage of modern radar coverage, and pushed ministers to act. Think of it as noticing cracks in a dam and insisting someone buys sandbags and a cement mixer, not just signing a polite note of concern. He was especially vocal about air power and technology. Churchill championed the expansion of the Royal Air Force and supported domestic aircraft manufacturing, helping create the environment where fighters like the Spitfire and Hurricane could be produced in quantity. He also recognized the value of new scientific tools and backed the deployment of the chain-home radar network, developed by scientists including Robert Watson-Watt. That radar system functioned like an early warning bell, giving controllers time to scramble fighters. Simple cause, clear effect. In everyday terms, it's the difference between hearing footsteps behind you and turning around in time versus being surprised. Preparation extended beyond weapons into organization and industry. Churchill brought influential figures into government to speed production, most famously enlisting Lord Beaverbrook to oversee aircraft production and push manufacturers to retool quickly. Factories that once built cars or consumer goods were shifted to make engines, shells, and planes. It's similar to a local bakery switching to bake bread for an entire town when a supermarket supply chain freezes. He also promoted stockpiles and logistics planning so units in the field had fuel, ammunition, and spare parts when needed, because a well-fed machine runs far better than one waiting for delivery trucks. Foresight for Churchill meant trusting expertise and making it part of decision-making. He gave scientists and intelligence analysts a direct line to cabinet discussions, supported code-breaking efforts at places like Bletchley Park, and insisted that technical advice not be buried in bureaucracy. The practical effect was quicker, smarter choices. When engineers said a radar station would extend coverage by so much, political leaders cleared funds without endless committees. Preparation, in his view, reduced panic and bought time. As he might appreciate, it's better to bring an umbrella and stay dry than to be fashionable and soaked. Building coalitions, managing allies and rivals. Churchill built wartime partnerships by treating diplomacy as both a craft and a daily habit. He combined public speeches that reassured millions with private conversations that steadied leaders. Close, sometimes cheeky, personal exchanges with the American president helped turn a distant ally into an indispensable partner. At the same time, measured suspicion of the Soviet leader never stopped him from cooperating where survival demanded it. Domestically, he solved rivalries by folding opponents into the project, giving them responsibility and a stake in success, so that opposition warmed into joint purpose. At home, he put political rivals into the engine room of government rather than leaving them on the sidelines. Labor figures were invited into top posts and into decision-making, not as window dressing but as active participants. This reduced backbench mutiny and made the whole effort feel national instead of factional. The trick was simple and practical: make rivals partners on problems they could solve, and hold them accountable for results. Think of a manager who hires a talented competitor into a team and then gives them a high-profile task. Suddenly they are too invested to undermine the project. On the international stage he mixed charm, firmness, and an almost surgical sense of priorities. With allies he cultivated warmth and shared jokes, which eased negotiations. He also made clear where he would not yield, preserving credibility. Relations with the Free French leader were more strained. Public disagreements and private tensions popped up, but even there Churchill balanced respect for the French cause with the hard need to coordinate military action. In dealings with powerful partners he often preferred direct, candid talks to triangular or committee politics. A blunt, well-placed sentence at the right moment sometimes achieved what pages of memos could not. Practical methods matter more than speeches. He used small gestures, a public accolade, a private note, an invitation to tea, to keep egos satisfied and cooperation steady. He employed compromise as a tool, offering partners small wins in return for larger strategic alignment. When trust was thin he relied on shared goals and repetitive contact to build a working routine, regular meetings, exchanges of information, visible joint statements that reassured publics on both sides. The human side of coalition building is easy to forget: a sincere compliment, a roasted chicken at a long table, or a short telegram saying, "We're in this together," can cement alliances. And when things got tense, he could be blunt. A bit of straight talk clears fog. Humor helped, too. A smile or a wry remark after a fraught meeting reset the room. The War Cabinet as a laboratory of decisions. Churchill built a compact inner circle of ministers and advisers that served as his practical testing ground for big decisions. Meetings were intense and private, often centered around a map table where pencils and pins stood in for laboratory instruments. Intelligence summaries, military sketches and shipping reports were spread out like experiment notes. Everyone could point and argue, and the room itself became a tool for thinking out loud. The group treated options as hypotheses to be tried, not as sacred doctrines. A proposed convoy route would be debated, its weaknesses picked apart, countermeasures suggested, and then a clear course of action set, sometimes tested and adjusted after the first real-world result. That trial-and-error approach is easy to relate to. It's like rearranging a crowded living room to fit a new sofa, seeing that the lamp shadows the TV, and then swapping a side table rather than starting over. Small, fast tweaks often mattered more than grand pronouncements. Secrecy and speed were essential. Discussions were off the record so ministers could argue freely without grandstanding for public opinion. This allowed frank assessments of risk and honest airing of doubts. A frank exchange could cut through bluster and reveal the simplest workable plan. In modern terms, it resembled an agile team huddling to unblock a project, quick, focused, and willing to change direction if the evidence suggested it. Shared responsibility underpinned the dynamic. Even when debate was sharp, the group presented a single, unified decision afterward, which made implementation easier across departments. That unity was like a sports team agreeing on a play. The coaches call stands, but the players have already argued the pros and cons in the locker room. Practical examples included rapidly reallocating scarce resources, prioritizing transport to one theater over another, or approving diversionary operations to protect convoys, all decisions that needed close weighing of intelligence, logistics and political consequences. Personal style mattered too. Churchill encouraged vivid briefing, maps marked in colored pencil, slip notes, and blunt-spoken summaries, and he expected ministers to cut through jargon and tell him plainly what could be done. Humor and bluntness eased tension. A sharp one-liner could break a deadlock as effectively as a long memorandum. That mix of practical tools, open argument, secrecy and collective follow-through is what made the War Cabinet function less like a formal committee and more like a hands-on workshop for decisions. Strategic intuition versus analytical planning. Churchill often trusted his gut, yet he built structures to test that instinct. He ran a tight war cabinet and stayed close to his chiefs, reading their papers and asking blunt questions. When professional soldiers argued for careful, step-by-step campaigns, he sometimes pushed for bolder moves that could change momentum or morale. That tension, spark versus spreadsheet, shaped many of his choices. Intuition for him was not mystical. It came from long familiarity with politics, diplomacy, and military affairs, and from a habit of looking for simple leverage points, a weak flank, an exposed supply line, or a dramatic action that would lift spirits at home. Analysis provided the counterweight. Staff officers produced maps, logistic tables, and contingency lists. They showed what men, ships, and fuel were actually available. The two approaches served different purposes. Think of it like planning a family move. One person decides the new neighborhood will be better and pushes the idea, another person checks utility hookups, moving vans, and budget. Both roles matter. Concrete clashes illustrate the difference. Some of Churchill's instincts led to innovative raids and deception efforts that confused enemies and kept pressure on them without committing huge armies. At the same time, earlier in his career he backed amphibious plans that lacked the detailed preparation needed, which ended badly and taught hard lessons about how much analysis must underpin even the boldest ideas. Later, he learned to rely on the detailed work of figures like the Chief Military Staff while reserving the right to set audacious political and strategic aims. He could order a daring objective, then allow the planners to figure out the how. For leaders today the lesson is practical. Use intuition to set direction, to spot unconventional opportunities, and to motivate people. Then hand the concept to analytic teams to stress-test logistics, timelines, and risks. In everyday life that looks like choosing a career pivot because it feels right, and then listing skills to acquire, budgeting time, and talking to mentors. A little courage plus a good spreadsheet beats either alone. And yes, a sense of humor helps. When a gut call goes sideways, call it an experiential investment and bake the team cookies. Intelligence, code breaking, and information flow. Churchill kept secret messages that had been worked out by codebreakers at the very center of his planning, insisting that he be read into the most sensitive findings and that only a tiny circle of ministers see them. He treated the decrypted Enigma traffic, called Ultra, with strict care and often limited its spread so that the enemy would never suspect their codes were broken. This was not just paranoia, it was practical tradecraft. If you tell too many people how you know something, you risk losing the source. Think of it like knowing your spouse's surprise party plans and deliberately pretending you just happened to be passing by the venue. He took a personal interest in the people who turned scrambled letters into useful facts, and he backed the places where that work happened. Bletchley Park became famous as the hub where mathematicians, linguists, puzzle fans, and ordinary clerks turned intercepted signals into clear information. Churchill recognized that unusual skills mattered. People who liked crosswords and mathematics could make the difference between a lost convoy and a saved one. He visited the site, praised the teams, and ensured they had the resources they needed. Practical support mattered as much as praise. Hiring the right people and keeping them focused was his kind of problem-solving. Information itself had to be handled smartly. Churchill balanced the need for rapid flow with the need for secrecy. Key reports and map updates would be presented to him and his inner circle in the map room and in concise daily briefings so decisions could be made quickly. Yet outwardly, actions based on secret decrypts were often explained by other sources, patrol sighting reports, captured documents, or even lucky break stories, so the true method stayed buried. That is like telling your neighbors you went upstairs because the light needed fixing, while really retrieving something you hid there. It keeps the method safe. Coordination across services was another of his concerns. He pushed for better links between naval intelligence, air intelligence, the codebreakers, and field agents so that raw intercepts could be turned into clear plans. When a message said U-boats were likely in a stretch of ocean, the Navy, convoys and aircraft had to act in concert, fast. He also supported controlled deception efforts that shaped what the enemy thought they knew. Misleading the opponent required the same careful handling as top-secret decrypts. Keep it tight, make it believable, and feed it into the information stream without revealing your hand. That approach was part leadership and part stagecraft, an odd combination, like running a theater where the props must sometimes be bombed. All along, Churchill's attitude mixed urgency with a sense of the absurd. He understood that intelligence work was painstaking, often dull, and quietly heroic. Breaking a code is not glamorous, it is more like doing a gigantic, nation-sized jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing. He appreciated the tiny, steady victories that kept supply lines running and decisions informed, and he knew when to protect a secret fiercely or when to use it to steer events without ever admitting the source. A little mystery, managed well, can be a powerful tool in a leader's kit. Air power debates, science, ethics, and strategy. Churchill treated the air war as a practical lab where machines, minds, and morals all had to prove themselves. He backed the development of new tools, things like radar and bigger bombers, because they changed what commanders could hope to achieve. Radar can be described simply as a way of seeing with radio waves. When you cannot rely on human eyes because of night or fog, radar sends out a signal and listens for echoes, much like shouting in a canyon and waiting for an answer. That basic idea turned the night sky from a dangerous black hole into a place where defenders could plot raids and intercept attackers, and Churchill pushed for that kind of research even when money was tight and politicians grumbled. He liked gadgets, fewer people knew he liked them almost as much as his cigars. The central strategic argument he faced was whether air power should be used to smash an enemy's ability to fight at its source or to help the troops already on the ground. Think of it like dealing with a leaking pipe. Do you rip out the whole plumbing system to be sure the leak is solved, or do you patch the drip under the sink so the kitchen can keep functioning today? Strategic bombing aimed at factories, transport hubs, and the morale of a nation, the rip out the plumbing option, while tactical air support focused on attacking what was directly threatening soldiers, the under-the-sink approach. Churchill did not see these as mutually exclusive, but he did press for the capacity to carry out the deeper, strategic blows because he believed that undermining an enemy's production and movement could shorten a conflict. That made him a supporter of the RAF's heavy bomber effort and of the leaders who organized those big raids. Ethics constantly complicated the technical and strategic talk. Precision bombing, when technology allowed, meant aiming at a single building or factory. Area bombing meant striking wide zones to destroy networks of industry or to break civilian morale. In plain terms, precision is like tossing a stone at a single window, while area bombing is more like throwing a bucket of pebbles at the whole wall. Churchill accepted hard choices here. He knew that civilian lives were at stake and that the British population had already suffered deeply, which made the argument for decisive measures emotionally and politically weighty. He also showed concern for cultural and civilian targets when possible, and discussions in wartime government often weighed military advantage against the risk of destroying historic cities or harming neutral populations. Those conversations were not abstract, they were about real people in real homes, and that kept the moral questions alive even amid urgent strategic needs. Technology shaped the debate as much as morals or strategy did. Improvements in navigation, bomb sites, and night-flying techniques made targeted strikes more feasible, while better detection and air defenses made unescorted raids far more dangerous. A simple analogy: if you used to have a paper map and now you have GPS, you might choose a smaller car for a delivery run, but if the roads are full of patrols, you might need a convoy. Churchill understood that what was possible in the air dictated what could be ethically and strategically justified on the ground. He was pragmatic about trade-offs, recognizing that perfect precision was often unavailable, and that leadership sometimes required choosing the least bad option. These debates remain practical lessons for today. Modern equivalents, precision-guided munitions, drones, electronic warfare, raise many of the same questions about effectiveness, civilian risk, and political consequences. Investing in better seeing and aiming tools reduces harm, but rules, judgment, and clear strategy matter just as much. In short, build good instruments, know what you want them to do, and keep asking whether the action will really solve the problem or just move it elsewhere. And remember, as Churchill might have smiled at, even the smartest machine needs a sensible human at the controls, preferably one who can tell a good plan from a bad one and has a decent sense of humor when the unexpected happens. The leadership of speech, rhetoric as social engineering. Churchill turned public speaking into a tool for steering a nation's mood and actions, not just informing them. He used everyday words to explain hard choices, repeating simple phrases so listeners could remember and repeat them back, which turned private thoughts into public resolve. Radio broadcasts and speeches in Parliament carried his voice into living rooms and factories, making abstract strategy feel personal. People heard a leader who named the danger and then handed them a clear role to play. Short, direct lines like, "We shall never surrender," worked like a drumbeat. They set a rhythm people could march to. He treated rhetoric as social engineering in the plainest sense, shaping how people thought about themselves and each other so they would act differently. Rather than launching into long academic arguments, he painted scenes and used memorable images. Hardship became a shared project rather than a random catastrophe. Repetition, contrast, and metaphor were his tools. Repeat a phrase and it lodges in the mind. Contrast comfort with sacrifice and you create a moral choice. Use a domestic image, and the nation becomes a household to protect. These are simple moves, but they change conversations at kitchen tables and on factory floors. Delivery mattered as much as words. A speaker's tone, timing, and pauses can make a sentence feel like encouragement or an order. Churchill's cadence, a rise and fall, a pause placed like punctuation, gave ordinary sentences a sense of weight. People could hear where to clap, where to stand firm, where to grieve. In everyday life, the same trick works: a trusted teacher pausing before the key idea, a coach lowering their voice to make a point stick. The effect is practical. When voice and content match, audiences are guided toward coordinated action with less confusion and more trust. He also borrowed techniques from storytelling to create usable identities. Labels such as "we" and "they" are small words with big power. They make strangers into teammates and dangers into targets. Framing a hardship as a test, or a challenge as shared work, turns isolated fear into collective responsibility. For instance, when leaders describe a problem in terms that include ordinary people's efforts, turning civilians into helpers, workers into defenders, participation grows naturally. Think of it like a manager giving everyone a small, meaningful task. People step up because the job is clear and tied to something larger. Humor, too, played a role, used sparingly to humanize him and diffuse panic. A well-placed wry remark can remind listeners that life goes on, even under strain. That tiny easing of tension makes the next instruction easier to accept. The broader lesson is practical and current. In any crisis, words that are clear, memorable, and tied to concrete actions will steer groups more effectively than vague assurances. Speak plainly, give a role, and people will often rise to it, sometimes with a little grumbling, sometimes with quiet pride, but often with real results. Maintaining morale, symbolism, imagery, and ritual. Churchill understood that visible signs matter when people are scared, and he used them deliberately to keep spirits up. He became a walking symbol. The unmistakable silhouette with a cigar and a determined pace sent a message even before a word was spoken. Public gestures mattered too. The two-finger victory sign, which he flashed in public, was simple and easy for others to copy, so it spread quickly and gave people a tiny, repeatable act that felt like resistance. Radio speeches filled a different role. His voice painted pictures and framed the struggle in terms people could grasp, turning complex strategy into clear, rallying ideas like, "we shall fight," that people could repeat to each other at kitchen tables. He layered imagery into everyday life so hope felt normal rather than remote. Photographs of landmarks standing after bombing raids became proof that the city's spirit had not been crushed, and images of leaders visiting damaged neighborhoods showed solidarity in a tangible way. When a leader visits a ruined street, it's not a staged photo op, it tells neighbors they are not forgotten. Simple home examples work the same way: a coach wearing the team's colors during a losing streak, or a principal walking the halls after a difficult week, both send the same quiet signal that someone cares and that things will be tackled together. Rituals added rhythm to anxious lives and made uncertainty manageable. Regular radio broadcasts, frequent public appearances, and repeated slogans gave people a timetable to hang on to, like landmarks on a long walk. On the personal side, Churchill's own routines, known habits such as naps and late-night working sessions, had a practical effect. They helped him stay steady, and when the public knew their leader was tireless and calm, it reduced panic. Think of it like a family where dinner happens at the same time every night. That predictability matters more than you might think when everything else feels chaotic. Symbolism, imagery, and ritual blended to create practical morale tools rather than empty pageantry. Simple visuals that anyone could reproduce, a hand sign, a poster, a photograph, turned private hope into public action. Everyday analogies help. A bicycle light makes you visible at night, and a regular group text from friends keeps you connected. Both small things prevent bigger problems. And humor helps too. A leader's trademark item, like Churchill's cigar, can feel almost mascot-like, providing a touch of personality that people latch onto when times are grim. Small, steady elements like these were not magic, but they worked together to make courage contagious. Crisis management, calm under catastrophe. As British Prime Minister during the nation's gravest emergency, Winston Churchill turned crisis management into a practice of steadiness, clarity, and relentless action. He insisted on having the facts close at hand, surrounded himself with the right advisors, and made decisions without tipping into panic. Calm did not mean passive, it meant choosing priorities quickly and communicating them plainly so others could act. He made visibility part of his leadership toolkit. Walking through bombed streets and visiting command centers were not photo ops alone, they were signals that someone in charge understood the reality on the ground. Small gestures like those matter. when a team sees its leader among them, nerves settle. Churchill's habit of showing up, listening, and then giving clear directives is exactly the sort of behavior a manager can copy when a project goes off the rails. No one expects perfection, they expect presence. Careful listening paired with decisive action was another hallmark. He read reports from many sources and welcomed blunt advice, yet he did not allow endless debate to stall necessary moves. That mix is useful in everyday life too: gather the facts, hear the experts, then pick a course and commit to it. For instance, a clinic director facing an unexpected influx of patients must accept input from nurses and doctors but still choose how to reallocate staff. Dithering only makes the crisis worse. Communication was kept simple and human. When he spoke to the public or to Parliament, he used plain images and repeated points until they stuck. Humor crept in sometimes, a wry line or a small aside that reminded people they were dealing with a human being, not a machine. Leaders today can borrow that: short, clear messages, repeated across channels, calm tone, and a touch of humanity, even a mild joke, cut through fear like light through fog. Personal habits supported his public poise. He carved out moments for solitary work, painting, long baths, brief naps, ways to reset that preserved mental clarity. It's practical advice: in the thick of an emergency, scheduled rest and small rituals stop burnout. And yes, his famous cigars and occasional brandy looked like indulgence, but they also signaled a consistent routine in chaos. Think of it as a leader's version of tying shoelaces before a run. Put together, these behaviors form a straightforward checklist for anyone managing catastrophe: be visible, collect facts, decide promptly, communicate simply, and keep personal routines to stay sharp. It's not a secret recipe. It's steady, human work, with the occasional cigar-sized sense of humor to remind everyone that people survive crises better when they feel led by someone who keeps their head. Risk, boldness, and the psychology of gamble. Winston Churchill learned to make big calls the hard way, from riding into battles as a young officer and reporting from foreign conflicts, to steering a nation under bombardment. He was comfortable with danger because he had seen it close up, and that familiarity gave him a tolerance for risk many politicians lack. At the same time he studied outcomes, weighed options, and did not romanticize danger. Some of his boldest moves were the product of calculation as much as courage. One clear example is a wartime plan he once championed that failed badly, showing that his appetite for daring could backfire, yet he treated failure as a lesson rather than an end. People who take bold gambles often display a mix of overconfidence and realism. Churchill showed both. He could be charmingly stubborn, convinced his choice was right, and yet he also solicited intelligence, debated strategy with colleagues, and adjusted when new facts arrived. Psychologically, gamblers tend to focus on potential gains when stakes are high, and that focus can shrink consideration of losses. Losses sting more than gains please us. People would rather avoid losing $10 than win 10. A leader like Churchill used optimism as a tool. It mobilized others, but he paired it with study and contingency plans, because hope without plans is just wishful thinking. Think about choosing to move to a new city for a job. Excitement pushes you, a spreadsheet and a backup plan stop you from getting stranded. Risk-taking for Churchill was also a rhetorical act. He knew that bold words can change the behavior of allies and enemies alike. Declaring determination can make a risky military move seem less like a panic and more like a calculated pressure point. That's a psychological move. It shifts how people perceive probabilities. Everyday example: if you tell a team you are committed to a tough target, those teammates often stretch further than if you mutter doubts. Humor helps here. Bold leaders who can crack a joke under pressure make risk feel survivable. Churchill often used wit to lighten the weight of danger, making the gamble appear less catastrophic than it might otherwise seem. Balance matters. The lesson from Churchill's approach is not to glorify reckless bets but to understand when boldness outweighs caution. Practical steps: break big risks into smaller experiments, run dry runs when possible, gather honest dissenting views, and prepare an exit strategy. In personal life that might mean trying a side business before quitting your day job. In politics or business, it could mean staging an operation in phases rather than all at once. And if you must take a large risk, make it with allies, thorough intelligence, and a sense of humor, because if the worst happens, laughter makes recovery easier. After all, betting the house in Monopoly is fun until someone pulls the hotel card. Prudent gamblers stash a spare tenner. Delegation, trust, and bureaucratic networks. Churchill preferred a tight circle for big decisions, and he built a system that let others carry out the details while he shaped the direction. He kept the war cabinet small so things moved fast. At the same time he relied on the professional heads of the services, the chiefs of staff, to translate political goals into military plans. That arrangement meant he could set the broad objectives, like where pressure should be applied, but leave the nuts and bolts of operations to people with the right technical knowledge. Delegation, for him, was not abdicating responsibility. He handed wide-ranging authority to ministers and commanders he trusted, then stayed engaged through frequent briefings and frank arguments. A good example is the way he empowered a minister to run aircraft production with sweeping powers. The minister was expected to deliver results and was given the leeway to reorganize factories, move resources, and make quick procurement decisions without endless paperwork. Think of it as a CEO giving a trusted operations director the keys to the factory. The CEO still watches the scoreboard, but trusts the director to keep the machines running. Trust was earned and tested in everyday habits. Churchill cultivated close working relationships with senior military leaders and senior civil servants, even when they clashed. He valued candid counsel and preferred advisors who would not simply flatter him. That frankness mattered. Some of his most productive exchanges were sharp disagreements that led to clearer choices. He also relied on trusted private secretaries and aides who managed sensitive information and smoothed communication between his office and the sprawling ministries. Those personal links reduced friction. In everyday terms, it's like having a few colleagues who know when to interrupt your busy day with the one item that really needs your attention. Bureaucratic networks under Churchill were reshaped to be more flexible and mission-focused. Existing departments were sometimes reorganized or given extraordinary powers so they could move quickly. Anno Domini hoc committees and special ministries cropped up when an urgent task needed a single owner. Intelligence and technical networks were integrated into decision-making too. Signals and code-breaking units provided a steady flow of top-secret information, and special operations units were coordinated with political aims. Bureaucracy here wasn't an obstacle to be tolerated, it was a toolkit to be retooled, with people placed where they could act fast. Practical methods kept the system working. Regular face-to-face meetings, daily summaries, and prioritized memos helped prevent bottlenecks. He liked concise, candid briefings that told him the problem, its likely solutions, and the recommended course of action. When time mattered, he would authorize direct channels between departments so decisions didn't stall in circular paperwork. Even today managers can learn from that, give authority, demand clear summaries, and build a handful of reliable pathways for important information. There was humor in the approach too. Churchill expected vivid opinions and strong personalities around him, and he seemed to enjoy the friction that came with capable, forceful subordinates. He could be theatrical, but he also knew that a well-placed piece of trust, handing a competent person the authority to act, multiplies effectiveness. In short, his model combined decisive political direction, real delegation of power, and flexible bureaucratic networks that were organized to serve urgent goals rather than preserve form. Churchill and Churchillians, personality and team dynamics. Winston Churchill combined a forceful public persona with a private habit of surrounding himself with a varied group of advisors, journalists, military officers, and civil servants who formed a practical working team. He was outspoken and theatrical in public, yet in private he sought people who could deliver blunt facts and careful plans. That mix, charisma up front, practicality behind the curtain, shaped how decisions were made and how the group held together under pressure. People who worked around him often brought complementary skills. Some were planners who spoke in steady, measured tones, others were doers who moved quickly and quietly, a few were talented communicators who could turn a policy into a speech. Put simply, the leader's role was to set the tone and keep direction, while the team supplied the technical detail and the push to implement. Think of a small business where the founder is the idea person and the staff are the ones who make the products. Both are needed, and conflict is normal when the visionary wants bold moves and technicians want careful testing. Churchill's personality mattered to team dynamics in predictable ways. His energy could be contagious, lifting morale during tough stretches. At the same time, a dominant voice can unintentionally stifle quieter opinions, unless the leader deliberately asks for different viewpoints. In practice, this meant the strongest teams around him were those that learned to argue openly and then accept the final decision. A useful comparison is a sports coach who encourages intense debate over strategy in the locker room, but then expects everyone to run the play together when the whistle blows. Simple techniques helped manage that balance. Encouraging a devil's advocate to raise tough questions, or assigning a detail-focused deputy to check assumptions, creates a safety valve for tension. Psychological safety, a phrase that means people feel they won't be punished for speaking up, was not always guaranteed, but where it existed, the team produced better plans. Imagine a family deciding on a holiday trip. If one person always vetoes suggestions without listening, the group fragments. If, instead, arguments are welcomed and someone keeps track of the final itinerary, the trip works and everyone enjoys it. Practical examples from everyday life show how strong personalities and teams interact. A manager who talks loudly and tells inspiring stories might still rely on an operations lead to keep costs down. A charismatic teacher can motivate a class but needs lesson plans from the curriculum team. Humor helps. A leader who smokes a cigar during long briefings may become the human equivalent of a campfire, drawing people in, while the ones changing the light bulbs make sure the fire doesn't go out. The trick is to celebrate the storyteller but also applaud the people who sweep up afterward. There are pitfalls to watch for. Over-reliance on one dominant figure can create bottlenecks and fatigue. People may stop bringing fresh ideas if they fear being overridden. To prevent that, rotate responsibilities, establish clear decision rules, and acknowledge contributions publicly. Those practical steps keep loyalty from turning into sycophancy and keep a team adaptive. In short, strong personalities ignite action, but sustained success depends on skilled, varied teammates who can translate bold vision into reliable results. Relations with Roosevelt and Stalin, diplomacy in practice. Churchill and Roosevelt built a working friendship that went beyond formal alliance. They exchanged long letters, shared strategic goals, and trusted one another to carry heavy burdens in wartime. Their cooperation produced key joint statements about the aims of the fight, and they coordinated resources and plans across oceans. In personal terms, Roosevelt's easy charm and Churchill's energetic storytelling made for a duo that could smooth over rocky decisions and keep morale high. Think of two colleagues who not only divide a huge project's tasks but also call each other late at night to brainstorm when things go wrong. Differences in priorities surfaced often, and diplomacy became the art of balancing them. Churchill favored operations in the Mediterranean and other approaches that he believed would protect imperial lines and save lives in some theaters. Roosevelt pushed for coordination across all fronts and used American muscle and influence to shape the timetable. Stalin, focused on the Soviet Union's immediate security needs, pressed hardest for a strong, direct front in Europe to relieve pressure on his armies. These conflicting aims produced long arguments, compromises, and trade-offs. It's like planning a big family trip. One person wants the scenic route, another wants the fastest plane, and the third will only come if you guarantee their safety, so you haggle until someone accepts a compromise. Stalin's presence at the negotiating table added a very different flavor. He spoke little and absorbed a great deal, leaving his aides to clarify intentions and map out concessions. Churchill learned quickly that charm and wit had limited reach with a leader who preferred results over small talk. Still, Churchill tried a mixture of blunt talk and occasional flattery, recognizing that getting Stalin's agreement sometimes meant offering concrete, tactical promises rather than lofty rhetoric. Picture trying to persuade a stoic apartment mate to take on chores, mentioning the benefit for the whole household rarely works unless you also propose a clear schedule and something in return. Practical diplomacy was often messy and human, full of cigarette smoke, strong coffee, and the odd joke to break ice. Agreements were reached that knit the alliance together and set shared goals. Yet not all promises translated equally into post-war reality, and some of the tensions patched over during wartime became the seeds of later rivalry. That outcome shows the plain truth of diplomacy: you can forge a partnership under pressure, but unresolved incentives and unmet expectations can resurface. In everyday terms, it's like finishing a tough group project where the team celebrates success but then discovers the credit and future plans were not evenly discussed, awkward, but not unexpected. Churchill's style in these interactions combined stubbornness, theatricality, and a clear eye for practical outcomes. He could charm a friend, browbeat an opponent, and bargain through aides. Roosevelt often played the role of mediator and patron, using America's resources and his own personal warmth to keep partners aligned. Stalin remained inscrutable and results-focused. Together they showed that diplomacy in practice is less about perfect agreement and more about engineering workable paths forward when stakes are enormous. A small smile, a firm handshake, and the occasional strategic concession went a long way, and sometimes a good cigar helped keep the conversation going. Naval strategy and the battle for supply lines. Churchill believed that control of the sea decided whether an island nation could keep fighting or slowly starve. As a wartime leader, he treated shipping not as boring logistics but as the very heart of national survival, arguing that men, food, fuel and weapons had to move safely across oceans. He kept a constant eye on the Admiralty's plans and pushed for practical measures to protect merchant ships. Short supply convoys might sound dull, but he saw them as the bloodstream of a nation. Convoys were central to his approach, groups of merchant ships sailing together under naval escort. Think of it like a school bus with chaperones rather than lone kids walking home. Attackers are less likely to pick a crowded, defended target. Escorts included destroyers and corvettes that could hunt submarines, and sometimes aircraft that could spot danger from above. Anti-submarine tools were kept simple in explanation. Sonar, an underwater listening device, helped detect lurking submarines, while depth charges were like dropping a noisy, underwater alarm that also damaged the attacker. Minesweepers cleared hidden, floating traps. Practicality mattered more than fancy names. Intelligence and technology were braided into the strategy. Breaking enemy communications and using radio direction finding helped locate submarine concentrations before they struck. Radar and long-range patrol planes extended the Navy's eyes, and escort carriers brought air cover directly to convoys. Churchill liked technical talk only when it delivered results, so he backed these tools with the promise of resources and the pressure of public urgency. A simple example: if you can track a suspected thief on a delivery route, you can reroute the van and protect the cargo. The same logic applied at sea. At the strategic level, he balanced offense and defense. Blockading enemy ports and cutting off their supplies was aimed at weakening the opponent's ability to fight, while protecting friendly supply routes kept his own side supplied and morale up. He was persistent in pressing Admiralty planners to prioritize convoy escorts and air support rather than purely seeking dramatic fleet engagements. The result was a steady, sometimes tense effort to keep food on tables and fuel in tanks, an unglamorous but essential task that Churchill treated with both urgency and a dash of dry wit. He liked to remind colleagues that grand speeches win hearts, but steady convoys keep the lights on. Coalition warfare, sharing burdens and blame. Churchill had to manage not only armies but entire networks of partners who did not always want the same thing. He worked alongside leaders from the United States, the Soviet Union, Free France and other governments, and he balanced their military needs, political demands and national sensitivities. That meant plans had to be negotiated, not simply ordered. Supply lines and resources were pooled in some ways and jealously guarded in others. The United States provided huge amounts of equipment and material support that Britain desperately needed, and a formal Anglo-American military link helped coordinate grand strategy, but every concession came with give and take. At the center of this was the everyday practice of sharing burdens, troops, ships, supplies, so no single nation could be crushed alone. Britain relied on Commonwealth and Free French forces alongside its own. The Americans brought industrial muscle and fresh manpower. The Soviets tied up vast enemy forces on the Eastern Front. Each contribution relieved pressure elsewhere, but it also created friction. One partner would press for an immediate offensive, another would insist on conserving forces for a different theater. Negotiations therefore looked less like neat military orders and more like arranging a household move with several relatives, each carrying something heavy but complaining about who parked the truck. Sharing blame was the flip side of that bargain. When coalition plans worked, credit was dispersed and speeches were made. When they failed, responsibility could be diffused but also thrown around. Churchill knew that public and political opinion at home could demand someone to be held accountable, so he often accepted tough scrutiny to keep allies focused on the larger goal. At times he was the lightning rod for criticism, absorbing heat so coalition unity would not splinter. He also pushed back when necessary, defending joint decisions while reminding partners of what had been agreed, a mix of blunt talk, persuasion, and occasional humor to ease tensions. Practical techniques mattered as much as rhetoric. Joint military staffs and commanders coordinated logistics and operations, and regular conferences let leaders hash out strategy in person. Back-channel conversations smoothed over formal disagreements. Churchill used personal rapport, phone calls, private letters, and late-night meetings, to make deals that could not be sealed in public. Think of it like a team at work. You argue in the meeting, then take coffee together and figure out who will actually do each task. The coalition survived because leaders learned that blame could be shared when the cause was kept bigger than personal pride. Everyday examples help explain how complicated this was. If one country's navy guarded a convoy, another might supply the planes to protect it from the air, and a third would provide the fuel. If the convoy was lost, finger-pointing could start in 3 capitals. Churchill tried to manage that risk by creating clear responsibilities and by being ready to defend joint decisions in public. He also understood the human side. Leaders get tired, diplomats lose patience, and public morale can swing wildly. A well-timed joke, a private compliment or a stern letter could be as important as a battle plan. In the end, coalition warfare under Churchill meant constant bargaining, a readiness to share both burdens and blame, and a practical, sometimes messy diplomacy that aimed to keep very different nations pulling in the same direction. Innovation and technology, radar, tanks, and logistics. Churchill pushed hard for the tools that would give Britain an edge on the battlefield, and radar was one of the most important. In plain terms, radar is like using radio waves to shout into the dark and listen for the echo. It tells you where something is even if you cannot see it. He took the reports of scientists seriously, made room at the top for technologists, and helped get a national network built that could spot incoming aircraft before they arrived. An everyday comparison is a motion sensor light that turns on when someone walks by. Radar did the same thing for the sky, only with larger consequences and fewer surprised neighbors. The decision to share and develop that technology across partners proved practical, and showed how a leader who listens to engineers can turn abstract lab work into concrete protection. Plus, it gave radar operators a new kind of green screen drama, minus the popcorn. He showed a similar appetite for armored vehicles, backing the idea that battlefields needed machines that could move through mud and barbed wire while protecting their crews. Tanks are essentially mobile, armored platforms carrying people and weapons. Think of a very tough car designed to keep its passengers safe while it does the heavy work. Churchill had been an early voice for such machines and later kept pressing for their improvement and production, insisting factories focus on making enough of the right kinds. A useful household example is choosing a sturdy all-wheel drive vehicle for winter travel. It won't win races, but it will get you and your groceries through a storm. He also understood that tanks alone cannot win. They need fuel, ammunition, and maintenance, which returns us to the theme he never tired of stressing, the practical trail behind the fighting front. Logistics was where Churchill's strategic mind became most down-to-earth, because the fight is only as strong as the supply chain that supports it. Moving fuel, food, ammunition, and spare parts across seas and land requires planning that resembles organizing a huge, very complex household, schedules, backups, and contingency plans. He reworked priorities so that industries producing planes, ships, and vehicles got the raw materials and factory space they needed, and he wasn't afraid to shake up ministries to make production faster and more efficient. Think of throwing a big family reunion. If one person forgets to bring the turkey, someone has to pivot and call the deli. That kind of nimble problem-solving and the ability to reassign responsibilities kept efforts focused and stores stocked when it mattered most. All three strands, detection, fighting machines, and the supply system, were stitched together by Churchill's practical curiosity and willingness to cut through red tape. He met scientists and factory bosses, asked pointed questions in plain language, and sometimes browbeat officials until decisions were made. The result was a loop where a radar warning could channel armored formations to meet a threat, and logistics would make sure those formations had what they needed on the move. In modern terms, it reads like an early lesson in systems thinking. Technology alone is not enough, you have to build the whole support network around it. And if he had one weakness, it was a fondness for gadgets. He liked new devices almost as much as he liked his cigars, which made him both a passionate patron of innovation and an entertaining, if insistent, advocate for turning ideas into action. Health, habits, and the physiology of endurance. Winston Churchill's daily life mixed intense work with very particular personal habits, and those habits shaped how long he could keep going. He liked strong cigars and a tipple while he worked. These were part ritual and part comfort. He also built in a mid-afternoon pause that looked like a nap but functioned like a reset button, short, deliberate, and followed by a return to demanding tasks. Painting and long, aimless walks were not mere hobbies for him, they were methods of recovery, ways to change blood pressure, mood, and focus without a doctor's intervention. Smoking and drinking have clear effects on the body that help explain why some people can sprint mentally for hours and yet pay for it later. Cigars deliver nicotine and tar, and long-term use makes it harder for the lungs and heart to supply muscles and brain with steady oxygen. That is why someone who smokes may notice breathlessness on a steep set of stairs or feel slow to recover after exertion. Alcohol, even in small nightly amounts, can seem to relax the mind while actually lowering sleep quality and making morning focus worse. A funny but truthful example: a night of celebratory drinks can feel like a short-term boost, but the next day's decisions can be foggy, like trying to read a map with a smudge across the ink. Endurance is not only about what goes into the body but also about rhythms and rituals. Churchill's pattern of short, intense work periods punctuated by naps and creative diversion is a good example of how pacing matters. The body stores and spends energy in cycles. Stress hormones rise during crisis and must be balanced by deliberate recovery if performance is to be sustained. Simple practices, stepping outside for 5 minutes, sketching a scene, or taking a brief nap, can bring the same restorative effect that prolonged, unbroken labor cannot. Those small pauses are the difference between burning bright for a day and sustaining effort week after week. Practical lessons drawn from his habits are clear and modern. Relying on stimulants for long stretches buys time at a cost. Better to combine focused work with reliable recovery. Keep a creative outlet or a calm routine, because mental refreshers change the body's chemistry in helpful ways. Use naps selectively, avoid turning alcohol and tobacco into the mainstay of stress relief, and build trusted people around you who can take over when fatigue wins. Churchill showed remarkable bursts of endurance shaped by his lifestyle choices, some of which helped him think clearly in moments of pressure, and some of which left a toll to be managed later. A touch of humor helps too. A good habit is worth keeping, but a good cigar should never be mistaken for an energy drink. Decision-making failures, blunders, lessons, and corrections. As First Lord of the Admiralty, Churchill pressed for a bold naval move through the Dardanelles that turned into the Gallipoli campaign, a plan that underestimated enemy defenses and overestimated what naval fire alone could do. The idea seemed simple on paper: force a choke point, open a new front, and knock an adversary out of the war. In practice, the beaches were heavily fortified, landing troops met unexpected obstacles, and supply lines were tenuous. Coordination between ships and land forces was patchy at best. That mismatch between plan and reality is the core of the blunder, good intentions without the right groundwork. He accepted political responsibility and took the professional hit that followed, stepping down from his admiralty post when critics demanded answers. Critics pointed to weak intelligence, poor timing, and a lack of realistic rehearsal for amphibious landings. Those criticisms were grounded in specific failings: inadequate reconnaissance, optimistic assumptions about terrain and enemy response, and insufficient joint planning between the Navy and the Army. In civilian life, it's the equivalent of signing off on a house extension before anyone checks the soil or calls the plumber. The result is a leak, a bill, and a lot of backwards glances. Later, another misstep in northern waters highlighted different weaknesses: hurried operations, unclear chains of command, and poor logistics in extreme conditions. Harsh weather and complex geography exposed planning gaps, and the effort showed that political urgency can sometimes outrun military practicality. The public and parliamentary debates that followed forced hard conversations about how to align political aims with military capabilities. The practical correction that emerged was not magic but methodical: listen to field commanders, build detailed plans, and accept that sometimes a bold idea needs a slower, steadier delivery. From these errors came concrete lessons that shaped later success. Churchill learned to value joint staff work and better intelligence, and to appoint commanders who could translate bold vision into manageable steps. He also learned to take criticism without turning it into vanity-driven stubbornness. Flexibility proved more useful than ego. For everyday leaders, the takeaway is simple: if you want a successful project, check the facts, coordinate your team, and have contingency plans. Otherwise you'll be like someone trying to drive a new car without learning where the brake is. Lightheartedness aside, those corrections mattered, and they turned some of Churchill's earlier mistakes into schoolbooks for how to improve decision-making under pressure. Memory and media, crafting a heroic narrative. Winston Churchill shaped how people remembered him by managing the channels through which his words and image reached the public. He spoke directly and often, using radio and big public speeches to turn private resolve into a shared feeling. Photographs and portraits captured a look of stubborn defiance that could be replayed in newspapers and film newsreels, and his own books and articles gave a long-lasting, written version of events that others would later quote. The result was not accidental: it was a careful mixture of rhetoric, image, and storytelling. His speeches worked like a steady hand on the rudder of public opinion. Short, punchy lines could be stitched together by news readers and repeated by ordinary citizens at the dinner table. A strong, memorable phrase functions like a catchy tune: it gets stuck in people's heads and becomes part of everyday conversation. Think of a team leader in a small company who repeats a simple slogan at every meeting. Over time, that phrase becomes the team's identity. Photographs and portraits contributed a different kind of memory: the visual shorthand. An intense photo or a painted portrait can suggest character traits without a single word. Photographers sometimes staged moments to accentuate expression. One famous portrait shows a pose that many later used as shorthand for resolve. People still point to it when discussing leadership. In everyday life, this is like trimming a family photo before hanging it on the wall. You choose the angle that says what you want about who you are. Books and memoirs gave dimension and explanation to those images and quotes. By writing at length about causes, decisions, and feelings, a leader turns short-term headlines into a broader story that historians and the public can return to. These written accounts allow an explanation of motives and a defense against critics. It's similar to keeping a diary after a big event. Later, when someone asks why you did what you did, you can pull out your own version of the story. The media environment amplified and sometimes simplified these elements. Editors decide which photograph runs on the front page, which lines make the headline, and which moments get replayed in film. Over time, a pattern emerges: repeated images and phrases harden into myth. Local examples show the same dynamic. A few well-chosen quotes in a school newsletter can turn a thoughtful teacher into a legend among parents. Humor helps here, even without social media, people found ways to make leaders trend. Memory is also shaped by informal storytelling. Friends, neighbors, and later generations pass on anecdotes that reinforce the public narrative or poke holes in it. A story told at a pub or a family gathering can make a public figure seem approachable or larger than life. In many ways, the private chatter around a hero is as important as the official press releases that built him up. Finally, retrospectives and dramatizations refine the narrative over time. Films, TV dramas, and museum displays select scenes and lines that fit a coherent story about courage and leadership. Those curated choices can both illuminate and simplify. They tell a neat tale that helps people understand a complex past. Think of it like editing a home video into a highlight reel. The real life was messy, but the reel gives a clear, shareable impression. A little theatrical flourish never hurts either, and sometimes a touch of that makes history memorable. Moral complexity, bombing campaigns and ethical trade-offs. Winston Churchill wrestled with the idea that bombing enemy cities might be both a military tool and a moral burden. He supported efforts to attack German industry and transport networks from the air, and he backed the commanders whose tactics often aimed to break production and morale. At the same time, he faced hard questions about civilian deaths, the visibility of suffering, and whether destroying whole neighborhoods could ever be justified by military aims. One clear dilemma came when intelligence offered opportunities that moral instincts resisted. After a major enemy raid, for example, there were calls for immediate, massive retaliation. Churchill sometimes held back, not because he lacked resolve, but because acting rashly could expose critical secrets or make later strategy worse. That decision-making shows how leaders weigh immediate emotional demands against long-term consequences. It's the difference between shouting back in the heat of an argument and taking a breath because you don't want to wreck a relationship you'll need later. The ethical trade-offs are easier to understand with everyday analogies. Think of a doctor deciding to operate on a patient when the surgery will almost certainly save many lives indirectly, by stopping an infection from spreading, but will put the patient through a terrible ordeal. Or picture a homeowner who must choose between demolishing a garage that shelters dangerous pests and hoping the pests leave on their own. Both decisions cause harm to prevent greater harm. In wartime, those choices are magnified. Entire neighborhoods, not just buildings, can be affected, and the people harmed are civilians, not combatants. Churchill's stance also shows how legal, moral, and emotional pressures can pull in different directions. Military leaders argued that area bombing could cripple an enemy's ability to fight. Moral critics said that deliberately targeting zones where civilians lived crossed a line. Churchill gravitated toward pragmatism when he believed it would shorten the conflict, yet he was not oblivious to the human cost. He sometimes pushed for focused strikes against factories and transport hubs when feasible, because such targets offered clearer military benefit while reducing unnecessary suffering. Leaders today still face similar choices, and technology has changed the tools but not the core problem: how to balance effectiveness with ethics. Public opinion and political accountability mattered as well. Civilian casualties from bombing became a powerful symbol, shaping both wartime resolve and post-war judgments. That pressure forced difficult conversations inside government about when to authorize broad campaigns and when to insist on tighter targeting. In modern terms, think about debates over precision strikes with drones or missiles. They promise less collateral damage, but every strike still carries the risk of error and unintended harm. Churchill's wartime judgments remind us that even experienced leaders must live with consequences and that moral clarity is often murky amid the smoke of conflict. There is a touch of grim humor in the idea that moral choices in war can feel like choosing the least ugly option. Nobody wants to pick the worst thing to do, but sometimes choices are between bad and worse. Churchill's record shows a leader constantly balancing outrage, strategy, and the practical limits of technology and intelligence. He neither sanitized the suffering nor embraced it casually. Instead, he tried to find a path that would end the fighting sooner, while knowing that sooner did not always mean painless. That tension remains a useful and uncomfortable lesson for anyone making decisions where human lives are on the line. Counterfactuals and what-if analysis. Britain's wartime choices under Winston Churchill are often replayed in historians' minds as if life were a chess game with alternate moves to test. He had been associated with the failed Gallipoli campaign in an earlier war, and later he led Britain through a near-isolation period and then into close collaboration with allies like the United States. These real events become anchors for asking simple but revealing questions. If one decision had been different, would the rest have followed the same way? That kind of careful wondering is what analysts call counterfactual thinking, forming plausible, what-if, scenarios to probe how decisive a choice really was. Think of counterfactuals as a mental laboratory where you change one factor at a time to see what might have happened. Keep it simple, change one thing, hold the rest steady. For example, historians sometimes ask what would have happened if a different political leader had been in charge when Britain faced its darkest hours, or if a military gamble had gone the other way at Gallipoli. These are not wild fantasies, they are structured experiments in reasoning. In everyday life, this looks like wondering what would have happened if you had accepted that job offer instead of the one you took. Small changes often ripple outward in surprising ways. A cup of spilled coffee can delay a meeting, which can change a conversation that alters a decision. History has similar chains of cause and effect. Using these scenarios well means being disciplined about plausibility and evidence. Start by stating the alternative clearly. What exactly is different? Then trace the causal chain. How would that change directly affect the next step, and what other factors would push back? For Churchill-related questions, that might mean looking at speeches, diaries, and contemporary reactions to test whether a leader's personal style could have pushed allies toward or away from compromise. Beware of hindsight bias. It's tempting to treat outcomes as inevitable once you know them. Instead, ask whether contemporaries saw the decision as risky or routine. Simple tools help. List immediate consequences, then ask what secondary effects those consequences would likely produce. This keeps speculation tethered to facts. There are real benefits to doing this thoughtfully. Counterfactuals expose which choices mattered most and which were swept along by larger forces, like economic weight or public mood. They teach leaders how much leeway they actually have, and they highlight the role of luck and timing. But they have limits. No matter how careful, you cannot prove an alternate past. You can only show that one scenario is more plausible than another. A playful comparison: you can test whether your umbrella would have stopped the rain, but you can't reopen the sky and try again. That caveat keeps the method humble and useful rather than fanciful. Practical steps make the method usable for modern leaders and students of Churchill alike. Frame a single, clear counterfactual, gather contemporary evidence that would have affected the decision, map out at least two credible chains of consequences, and assign relative plausibility to each link. Try role-playing with a small team. Ask someone to argue the alternate view and push against your assumptions. Businesses and governments do this now under names like scenario planning or red teaming, and historians borrow the same discipline to better understand personalities and institutions. When applied to Churchill, such disciplined what-if work helps explain not only how he steered certain outcomes but also why some turns of fate were out of his hands. Finally, keep a sense of humor about the exercise. It's useful to remember that counterfactuals are a thinking tool, not a time machine. They sharpen judgment, expose hidden assumptions, and can reveal the narrow margins that separate catastrophe from survival. Used correctly, they let us learn practical lessons from Churchill's leadership without pretending we can stage an alternate universe. Legacy studies: measuring influence with metrics. Scholars and cultural analysts often treat a leader's legacy as something that can be probed and partly quantified, using measurable signs to show how influence persists. Museums named after a leader, the frequency their speeches are quoted in parliamentary debates, the number of biographies and the way schools teach about them, all serve as pieces of evidence. Simple counts, like how often a name appears in newspapers or on social media, give a starting point, while deeper measures probe whether those mentions are reverent, critical, or merely nostalgic. Think of it like checking a person's popularity by looking at both their greeting cards and their bills in the mail. Both tell you something different. One common approach is to mix counts with content checks. Researchers might count how many times a speech line is reproduced, and then read samples to see if the line is used to inspire, to criticize, or to lampoon. This is called content analysis, but you can think of it simply as reading the context. Is the quote a rallying cry or a punchline at a roast? Another simple method is network mapping, tracing who cites whom in books, articles, and speeches to see how ideas flow. Imagine drawing lines between people in a conversation. The thicker the line, the more often they talk about each other. Online indicators, often grouped under the informal label altmetrics, look at downloads, shares, and mentions. They are like tracking who gets the most likes at a reunion, though likes don't always equal respect. Practical, current measures bring both clarity and odd surprises. A museum's visitor log shows ongoing public interest, but only if the building is accessible and promoted, otherwise the log says more about tourism budgets than memory. Curriculum presence, whether a leader features in school syllabi or exam questions, signals generational transmission of influence. If children learn about someone, the legacy is being passed on. Political speeches that invoke a figure demonstrate instrumental use. Quoting a famous line can be a way for a politician to borrow authority, much like wearing someone else's cufflinks to look distinguished. But beware of pitfalls. Numbers can be misleading, context matters, and monuments in one city can mean very little in another. You can count the number of statues, yet that number won't reveal whether those statues are admired, contested, or quietly ignored. Combining measures leads to more reliable conclusions, as long as the combination is sensible. Researchers build simple indices that weight different signals, public citations, educational mentions, cultural representations, to form a composite picture, but the choice of weights changes the story, so transparency is crucial. Qualitative study remains essential. Interviews, close readings of speeches, and local reactions explain why metrics rise or fall. For the casual observer wanting a practical takeaway, look at multiple signals rather than a single headline number, read a few of the contexts behind the counts, and keep a sense of humor. No single spreadsheet will capture a life, and statisticians will always try to make one fit, like forcing a square peg into a round lectern. We've walked through the big lessons Churchill leaves us: steady courage under pressure, clear and sometimes blunt communication, stubborn resilience that turns setbacks into plans, and the skill of bringing different people together to work toward a single goal. Strategy simply means making a plan that thinks a few steps ahead. Coalition just means teaming up with others who don't always agree but share a common purpose. Think of it like organizing a family road trip. Someone has to decide the route, calm the fuss, and make sure everyone chips in. These are not just historical notes, they're practical habits. A manager calming a team before a tough presentation, a coach rallying players at halftime, or a friend who helps a group settle on a plan for a move, all echo Churchill's methods. And yes, you can borrow his steel resolve without adopting his bowler hat or cigars, though a strong cup of tea might help. If this calm look at Churchill's leadership gave you a new angle on facing pressure, please like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Tell us in the comments which leadership trait you try this week: clarity, resilience, or coalition building, and share a small story if you have one. It helps others learn, too. Next time we'll take a closer look at Churchill's speeches and break down simple techniques you can use in everyday conversations, meetings, or presentations. We'll also compare his style with other leaders and pull out quick, useful tips you can practice tomorrow. Thanks for watching, stay steady, speak plainly, and see you in the next episode.